Bible between Jew and Gentile was Jew and everybody else. And we need to remember that here too. It's not that, and frankly, I have a lot in common with a Methodist doctrinally, as an Adventist.
Yeah, Baptist also.
Yeah, exactly. It might be easier for me to find some common ground with them, but as a Christian, I don't get to draw that line. So it's important to remember. Thank you, Byron.
It's really good to have the experience of worshiping together with other Christians. I mean, like for instance in Bible study fellowship, you're just all Christians, and you can learn a lot that way. And I was thinking of another instance when you might be worshiping with others, but that's one thing I just adore about KTSY. It's that it appeals to Christians across the board. And I just feel such a kinship with everybody who listens. And even though many times I don't have it on, but I just feel that kinship with those Christians out there, whoever they are. So, I know, there are a ton of them.
Yeah, there's tons of signs up in my yard, not my yard, in my neighborhood. One last thing about this day I want to talk about. The Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So, of course, he starts out, husbands, love your wives. But for me, the critical part of that verse is just as Christ loved the church. So what Byron said, remembering that the fellowship of Christ includes Baptists and Catholics and Muslims and everybody else, I also have to remember that it includes the people in my local church who I also disagree with sometimes and I see more often. It's often easier for me to, the fact of the matter is I rarely meet a Catholic day to day. I work at the press, I go home, I, see my kid and my wife, and, my interaction on a day-to-day basis is mostly within my own community. But it's perfectly easy for me to be irritated with and treat in an unchristian manner someone in my own community. And this is emphasizing that Jesus devoted himself to that church, that body. And it's important for me to treat those people. I don't know if Aline ever experienced this or anybody else who has worked for the church, but some of the most irritating customers we get are fellow Adventists. And some of the most abusive customers we get are fellow Adventists. And it almost feels like, it's like, oh, you're a fellow Adventist, so I can yell at you and you have to forgive me. So I'm sure nobody is thinking that consciously. I hope nobody's thinking that consciously, but it feels like that sometimes. And I need to remember that.
All you have to do is be in charge of a magazine that runs a story on, and now this was when I first started this adventure back in the late 70s, but if you ran a story on whether or not women could wear pants, the letters you got back were just astoundingly ugly. Anyway, I'm glad that we've relaxed some of that a little bit.
We talk about that, and you talk about when you first started there, but I was 6 years into working at the General Conference, that means that's going to be about the year 2000, when women were allowed to wear pants in the summertime. Well, they were already allowed to wear them in the wintertime because it was cold, but they finally were allowed to wear them in the summertime. And it was funny, me as a young person at that time, I'm like, I didn't even know that was part of the policy, that women couldn't wear pants in the summertime. The idea that we were just now, as a church organization, getting to that point was kind of eye-opening to me. So it was,
and so many of the laws in our country seem to have nothing to do with anything but controlling other people. I mean, it's not to stay safe or anything else. It's just to keep them in their spot where they belong.
Some are. You know, there's a reason why, you know, many people came to this country to, you know, for religious freedom, not just religious freedom. I mean, people came to this country for other kinds of freedom
To get rid
too.
of that king.
To get away, to get away from whatever situation they were in.
Right.
And so, yeah. All right, so let's move on to Tuesday. Breaking down that dividing wall that was, which one was it here?
You know,
that
it
was on the
interests me
previous,
that he never talks about the Berlin Wall coming down. In both, John McVeigh, both in what he wrote and what is in the It Is Written commentary. It's not that it's a bad thing, it just interests me because that's, yeah,
Well,
and
and
it's
fits
in
right
our
with this.
experience.
Yeah.
So anyway, go
Yep.
ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's good. All right, so we're going to answer the question here. What action does Paul say Christ took toward the law of commandments expressed in ordinances? Why did he take this action? All right, so we're going to read Ephesians 2:14 and 15. For he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one and broke down the barrier of the dividing wall, abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. All right. So, what do we think about that? The question here is, what action does Paul say Christ took towards that?
Well, he made himself peace. Yeah.
You know, it
And
says
he's
this
trying to make
roundabout here.
two. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it just says, abolishing in his flesh the enmity, which is the law of commandments contained in ordinances.
Oh.
So we know, the lesson talks a little bit about this. So we know from Paul's other writings, you know, if we, of course, take this verse out of context, there's a lot of ways we could take it. And some people do take it to be all the laws, everything has been abolished. So, you know, you're just under Christ, not any other responsibility. But we know from other, I see Byron, we know from other writings of Paul, both earlier and later, that he still took the responsibility to the law seriously, or that the law was there as a thing. So what do we think this maybe means? Go ahead, Byron.
First of all, we have to understand that the law the Lord took away was the ordinances about the sacrificial system.
Mm-hmm.
He also took away the sanctuary, the tabernacle, with the laws on the walls of the sanctuary that if you were not a Jew, you cannot enter. That's the law that is taken away, that everybody now can come into the presence of God in peace.
Mm-hmm. So my question there, I totally agree with you. So the next step, the next question that I had to ask myself with that is, does that mean that you should not do those things anymore that are listed in the ordinances? I know Peter was a Jew and continued to be a Jew, even though he was also a Christian. He did not stop going to synagogue. He did not stop, you know, doing those things. And the reason I ask this is I have had experience in my life over the years where I have met Adventists who are absolutely convinced that that those ceremonies are sinful, that we should not, you know, do them because God abolished them, and you're denying the grace that God gives you if you participate in those anymore. So that seems weird to me, but I'm curious what other people think about that.
I've always felt everybody has a connection with Jesus in their own way. Mm-hmm. And some people learn better kinesthetically, and so doing those things may bring them closer to Him. It's not those things, it's what brings you closer to Christ. Now, some of us are able just to talk to Him in our minds or pray wherever we are and what we do. Other people have to actually kneel down and to be able to focus and do their prayers. So I've always felt it was more of a personal way of how people could connect to Christ that would make that work for them. And
It sounds like what you're saying is by describing it in this way, we're making it clear that the way is open. Instead of there being this narrow way through these ordinance ceremonies and stuff, now we're open to God's love and participating in it.
That's how I've always felt, and I felt that
Aline and
that
then
way
Byron.
more people could come to him and not feel that they could only go through the tabernacle ceremonies and go that direction.
I'm thinking back to Spain and people who, all of them, came out of the Catholic Church. So when you went into their church, they had kneeling benches where there was a thing you flipped down to kneel on. They didn't want you to have real candles in the sanctuary, but they had electric chandeliers. Electric, like candlesticks, so like a lamp, only it was like candlesticks. And that seemed odd to me, but it helped them feel familiar without taking on what the negative of that they perceived as. Another thing, I was just talking to Pastor Jim on the way in, and I said, "Man, you're looking like a preacher," because he had on a suit. And he said, "I almost wore my Hawaiian shirt that I was in." And he said, "But I did he says, "But I'm really dressed this way because of the ordination service this afternoon." And they all have to look like preachers when they do this. And he said, "But I did leave off my tie because I said, well, it's Kuna." But my mom didn't like that stuff. She liked, she was elderly and used to people dressing up, and that's the way you need to come to church.
And
is
your
you need,
shoes are shined on
yeah,
Sabbath
the whole
and,
thing.
Yeah, the
So-
older people. Yeah, Friday night, Dad had to have us shine.
Yeah. It's just weird. And all these are just cultural things.
Many of them are. Go ahead, Byron.
Remember, the main thing that the Lord eliminated was all the sacrificial items that had to be done to show him coming. But the other things, the harvest, the first fruits, and the different feasts of different things to represent different events in your life, they're okay. It's not something you have to do, but think about the fact that when you pick up all the cherries or the peaches or whatever out of your fruit tree, think about the fact that the Lord has blessed you with that. Remember that. And so in these ordinances like that, yes, we can remember them, and you honor God by remembering them, but it's not something that's going to keep you from heaven. But it's our understanding that he loves us no matter what.
I think the key here, as I was thinking about this, what I came down to, the key here is here in verse 15, by abolishing in his